quite a few questions, and just I apologize if we're not able to get to your question. It was quite a bit of questions that were submitted, so we will try to get through as many as we can within the limited time that we have. So first question, and for this I need to put my other glasses on, unfortunately. Because, okay, Sandra, okay, what do you think will be the long-term consequences of emotional impact on children?
Well, obviously, depression, anxiety, fear. When you don't trust what's going to happen for the next day, especially for children. Children need structure. They need to know their parents are going to be there. They need to know they're going to eat at a certain time. They need to know that school's at a certain time, bedtime's at a certain time. They don't have that. They don't have trust in the world. When you don't have trust in the world, you sometimes tend to go and violate other people's because you don't form bonds and you don't feel that you can trust anybody and nobody respects you. So it can lead to the problems that we might have with maybe early pregnancy, drug use, gangs, truancy. We have a lot of children who are experiencing truancy.
Okay.
Due to the fear factor, they say, why should I go to school? There's no need. I'm not going to be here that long, so I might as well just skip school. Or let's get some pot, and we can feel better about this. So all of those factors.
Thank you. Mr. Christie, we heard today a lot about the benefits and advantages of immigration, but can you speak to the arguments on the other side, the downside, disadvantages of immigration or enforcement?
Well, I mean, that is really the other side of the ledger, and I was trying my best. I'm sorry. This is the advantage you get for being on the upper bench. They get her mic. So I was really trying my best to be fair on both sides of the ledger. The argument is, and I think that was sort of the argument in the early part of the 20th century also, is that immigrants are not always a plus, and they're a minus. I think all evidence says, whether it's on the economic front, the contributions that immigrants are making to our economy, the contribute in terms of creating employment, in terms of building businesses that we heard so much about, in terms of helping our sciences, in terms of contributing to the fiscal health of the country. They're all on the positive side. I think on the negative sides are people's inbuilt reaction to the fear. And that's the fear of the unknown. That's the fear of the unfamiliar. And that's been the history of our country. The fear that whether it's about at the level that they will not assimilate, or at the level that they will have an economic drain. That's, I think, been really as much a part of our history as there has been the positive. And I think people over time get to know that the positives outweigh the negatives. And that's why in Maine, in the totality, immigrants have been a net huge contributor to our society and to our country from the beginning of the time as they are today.
Thank you. Chief Wilson, you mentioned citizenship documentation isn't realized until jail. What is your impression of how the courts contribute or refute the fear? Does ICE take advantage of those in the judicial system, or does the court system have similar perspectives on documentation?
Wow, that's a mouthful. I don't know if I can speak directly to that. What I can say is if someone is actually in the criminal justice system, it is because they've committed a crime, versus what Michaela was talking about, which was detention solely based on immigration status. So I think we're talking apples and oranges there. So if someone has obviously committed a crime, that is why they've been fingerprinted, and that is why they are in the system itself.
Okay.
So I don't know if that helps at all.
That's
But
fine.
yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Nicole, Do any of the local organizations have an open dialogue with faith communities to make sure that sanctuary churches are participants in culturally responsive help that values the desires of the immigrants themselves?
Yes, I would say that we have at least four groups, churches in the metro area who have signed up to be sanctuary churches and have taken in 3 leaders from our community that have been in the news recently. And we have a coalition, Denver Metro Sanctuary, that's been sort of the main education component for other parishes to jump on board as potential sanctuary sites across Colorado. So we have parishes in Grand Junction and Montrose and Glenwood Springs, some in Colorado Springs that have said, if need be, we're ready to step up and our parish is ready to do this. I think one of the biggest sort of outcomes of folks taking sanctuary in the churches has been the education of parish members and general community that come and have an opportunity to speak to an immigrant and learn about this person's experience, their hopes, their dreams, how they ended up in procedures, what they've experienced over the course of 10 years, sometimes fighting their cases. And so it really draws home like the idea that it is your friend, your neighbor, your son or daughter's, friend that they play with at school. And so it's been a really great education opportunity for folks who've sort of had some interest in the issue, but now at a scale and with, templates, so to speak, of things that do work in terms of community education.
Thank you, Nicole. Kit, immigration is often paired with safety. Can you please explain the vetting process that immigrants and refugees go through?
All 14 steps.
Summarized in one sentence.
It's a very complex procedure that does involve multiple different federal agencies, over 14 steps. It's constantly being modified and improved as technology increases. I think it's important to realize that there's biometric testing, like iris scans of refugees when they enter the U.S. kind of process that is consistently checked, that there are interviewers from the Department of Homeland Security that go out and do multiple rounds of interviews. And I always think it's crazy because how do you prove that you've got this well-founded fear of persecution, right, to be that refugee? And so you might be tested against your memory of your husband or of your children to say, well, when you fled your village, was it raining? When you had your daughter, what was the first word that your husband said? Like all of these checks and balances that honestly, I would fail. So it's a long process. I think that you'll find that the resettlement program knows that that many of the people within the program are fleeing violence, and so there is that sense that we want to keep it a safe and a secure program, not only for the communities in which they resettle, but also for they themselves, since they generally have fled the very thing that we're fearing at the moment.
Thank you.
There's all sorts of good PowerPoints and things like that. If whoever asked that question, I can get you all those 14 steps.
Thank you. Georgia, you mentioned that the kids have constitutional rights by virtue of being in the U.S. Is this true under federal immigration law? Do they have these rights only if born in the United States and currently residing here, or is that broader to include all kids?
I'm not an attorney, and I don't play one on TV, so I can't answer the specifics, but our belief is in education, all students have a right to an education. Any student who walks in the door, we are obligated to provide that education to, and so that's our focal point. We know that if students are going to learn, we have to create an environment where they feel safe, where they feel valued, and so that is our perspective and our focus. And I think what we've tried really hard to do in Denver is to allow the political and legal issues to play out in a different place. In the school building, we're here to educate, and so we're trying to create environments where students and families will send students to school so that they are there to learn, and then as needed whether it's immigrant or refugee families, we have families with high poverty. When there are other factors like lack of food, lack of health care, mental health needs, that we create partnerships so that we can get the support so a student can actually come and is capable of learning.
Thank you. Michaela, this is a three-pronged question. So,
Oh, gosh.
and So, and if it can be brief, that would be great. How long is the average person kept in detention? How much do taxpayers pay per detainee per day? And these for-profit centers that you talked about, how much are they profiting?
Okay, so number one, how long? There are statistics. I don't know if you know off the top of your head the statistics. They're a little bit misleading because they incorporate people who have both been there, for 5 days and then accept a voluntary departure, accept a removal order, and those who are fighting their cases for, what can be a year or two while they're in detention. But I would say, based on our firsthand experience, for people who are fighting their cases and going through removal proceedings, it's typically between 3 to 6 months from when they first are detained until when they get an answer from the immigration judge. That doesn't include the appellate process before the Board of Immigration Appeals. I'm going to be fast, I promise.
Okay.
In terms of costs, there have been different studies, but it ends up costing around $150 per day for people who are in civil immigration detention. And there have been studies that have shown, there are community-based alternatives, ankle bracelets, check-ins with nonprofit organizations that are far more effective in terms of getting people to show up to court and cost far fewer dollars. And in terms of the amount of money, I'll just say that after, on the election, the stock for both the GEO Corporation and the Correctional Corporation of America went up exponentially. So there's huge amounts of money that are being made off of the civil detention.
Thank you. Laura? Yes. So how can the chamber work with conservatives in the Colorado legislature to be able to pass policies that really support what you were talking about with creating that workforce that we need?
Yeah, so I think our approach on this issue is the same as our approach with most policy issues. And the way that we do business as a chamber is we are rooted in data. We deal with facts, and we use those two things to make an argument. So we use economic data to support the need for change, and it's messages that absolutely we get out to both sides of the aisle in hopes that they can see ultimately the benefit of making policy changes.
Here's a question for all of you, and I'll take about three or four quick responses. Okay. Are there any new bills around immigration from the Colorado legislature this past year? And if you were to be able to go and introduce one bill, what would that be? And I thought all of you were going to be clamoring at answering that one.
I mean, if we had the ability to go ahead and I propose a bill once I leave the nonprofit sector, I'd like to maybe look at that, would be for Colorado to take the lead and maybe putting forward a comprehensive immigration bill. That's what I'd like to see happening.
I would say our members, I speak on behalf of member organizations who vote for our policy priorities every year, but I would say to continue our work of local policy relief. So the one thing that our members in our constituency keep asking for are work permits. So DACA was life transforming and transformative to so many folks. For people to be able to get an employment authorization document would be life changing for so many members of our community, not to mention an increase to state resources. If we were able to figure that out, that would be amazing in the absence of other forms of comprehensive immigration reform.
Want to speak a little bit louder? Would you?
Oh, I was just going to say, businesses would love that too, right?
Okay.
Any sort of workforce development is welcomed by the business community. I would say we have real needs, and so we would welcome increased number of workers always in Colorado.
Anyone else? If not, we'll move to the next question. Okay. As you know, our audience here is comprised mostly of folks from staff, board members of foundations, donors. So question to all of you. How can foundations, donors, be most helpful at this time? That's for anyone.
I would like to answer that. One of the problems and challenges that Centro La Familia has since its inception is that it's very difficult for us to get board members. And what I've assessed over the years is that when people have the ability to be board members, they often opt to go with nonprofits that have maybe more presence in the community, that are not dealing with issues that are as sensitive as immigration, and so we lose out. We really would love to have more qualified board members that could help Centro further accomplish its mission. So if any of you are familiar with any nonprofit that deals with the refugee or the immigrant population, one way you could really help them is by becoming a board member. We really need good board members.
Chief,
I think. Can you hear me? Okay. I think getting involved in your municipalities, whether or not you, if you're inspired by the things you're hearing here today or the things that you've heard since post-election, getting involved, running for council yourself, if you have that positive influence within the community, and if you're not so inclined, then to hold your city council members and your elected officials, your elected sheriffs, the chiefs of police accountable for what you expect as a Colorado citizen.
right.
Well, I mean, I've been long enough in this field to say this may sound self-serving, and I didn't mean that. I really think that people don't recognize that the philanthropic community, especially the foundations, have kept the immigration debate alive in this country. There would have been no immigration debate in the way we see it if foundations hadn't really stepped up to the plate, beginning in the 1970s to the present time. I mean, the comprehensive immigration reform movement has been really kept alive despite the paralysis in Congress by the foundation world. I would say that to the extent that any shift is required in the foundation world, it's to the point that McKellar would make normally. Yes, I think foundations have taken a back seat to funding legal services. They have thought that this is too expensive, too complicated, too messy to get involved in. And I think it's time for them to understand how critical providing the legal service at the right time is. And the models that are evolving now, many of them even here, are the things that foundations should look at to become more, to emulate in other places. And, I think the last thing I would say about the employers, I mean, I have actually been quite surprised. I've done some research in red states, Florida, Tennessee, as to how many of those legislators have become very active in improving enforcement of labor standards. And there's been argument made by employers, actually, talk about your point of how good, is that, look, if you allow bad employers to exploit unauthorized workers, that actually depresses wages and working conditions of everyone. And that only helps bad employers at the expense of good employers. That good employers really cannot compete against bad employers if we let people exploit. So sort of having new legislative measures to improve the enforcement of labor standards, I think, would be in the interest of everyone, including good employers.
Okay. And Georgia, I'm going to give you the last word.
I would say continued mental health support for families and for students, because there's trauma that already exists in many of our communities, and now we're exacerbating trauma. And I think the other one is in alignment with you. Our families have jobs, multiple jobs, but they're often low-paying and dead-end jobs. So helping create programs that support families, adults, so that they can become skilled workers and contribute to make life better for themselves and for their children.
So I'm going to just ask our panelists to remain seated. But before we go on, I just want to give our panelists a great round of applause. They've just been wonderful and excellent, and I hope that you've learned a lot from them today. I also would like to remind all of you that we will follow up with you with a list of resources and contact information for all our speakers as well.
It is a privilege to come to Denver, and particularly to the Rose Foundation, which obviously has done immense work in the world of philanthropy for a very long time, and I'm grateful that I'm getting to know more about it. This event that was organized, I have to tell you, is one of the most organized things I have ever participated in. These people are so. I showed up here yesterday and I was given a binder with 5 little tabs to tell me how my life is going to run for the morning. So. And so it's really an honor to be part of a group that takes these things so seriously. To Elsa and Tricia, who have sort of shepherded this thing, my special thanks for making this such a seamless event. I was basically given the task of trying to put in a broad context as to why immigration has become the big issue of our times. An issue that even in my time practicing in this area was an issue a few years ago that was confined to a few social workers and a bunch of immigration lawyers generally sitting in the basement of a church. That from that, how did it turn into an issue that has grabbed the country's imagination in such a big way? How is it that an issue like immigration could help launch the presidency of Donald Trump and probably even sustain it, and some would argue actually get him the presidency? And how is it at the same time that 10,000 lawyers on short notice of 5 hours would show up at our airports around the country after the first executive order was signed, alerting us that immigration had become sort of the civil rights issue of our times? How is it that in the last 5 years, every single state legislature in our country has enforced one form, has enacted one kind or the other of immigration law for enforcement in their own states? How is it actually that the Supreme Court of the United States, in every year now, issues at least 2 or 3 major opinions on immigration? Or you would say, how is it that Congress has grappled with it and has not come to terms with the immigration debate at least since 2000? How has it paralyzed our lawmakers, and how has it paralyzed our country? Essentially, how has immigration become the third rail of American politics? Like most issues, issues like this are grounded in a combination of facts, policy, and politics. Now, you would tell me, look, that's true of almost everything in public policy, but since I know nothing about legal marijuana, I'll just stick to immigration. First of all, let me begin with a dash of history, because history is really important. And the older you go, you realize history is the only thing that teaches you anything. And our history on this is very complicated. We consider ourselves to be the ultimate nation of immigrants. This is the poster child of nation of immigrants. Let me quickly remind you, for a nation of immigrants, we have always been ambivalent about immigration. George Washington himself is known to have said that the country did not need any more immigrants except for a few skilled carpenters. Ben Franklin, who was one of our more erudite founding fathers, and many consider was the founder of modern journalism as we know it, wrote a major essay in 1755 warning the country about the Germanizing of America, and said the Germans should no longer be admitted because they don't share our liberal democratic traditions. So as I like to say, even alternative facts have long roots in our history. In 1860s, a Know Nothing Party was launched precisely to campaign against Irish and the Catholics in the electoral process. But despite all this ambivalence, we actually had no federal laws in our country regulating immigration till 1875. It will probably shock you that we have had, immigration is one of the first things we should have regulated. We had some state laws which regulated ships coming into harbors and charging them per head that they would bring, essentially treating people as commodities, as commerce. That was our view of immigration for a very long time. Congress, for the first time in 1875, started paying attention to immigration. And it came in the context of not putting limits on immigration, what are your quantitative limits, but sort of qualitative limits. that Congress said that there are certain kinds of people we don't think we want in this country. And they focused on criminals, they focused on prostitutes, they focused on people who could not read, people who had communicable diseases, paupers, things like that, but no quantitative limits. The first major law Congress signed was in 1882, something called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which for the first time said we'll no longer accept any Chinese to come after they had built our transnational railroads and we didn't need them anymore. You could put them also in the qualitative limits, as if we thought that Chinese do not merit the hospitality of our country any longer. But from 1880s to 1920s was the era of mass migration, as historians like to call in our country. And Congress started paying attention to immigration in terms of numbers in the early part of the 20th century. And theories of eugenics were actually accepted as popular science. That our social scientists convinced lawmakers that there were certain European stock who were just not as good as another European stock. Really, theories of eugenics were sold to lawmakers that some Europeans were intellectually and physically inferior to another bunch of Europeans. And that was mostly against Southern and Eastern Europeans. The campaign was against Italians, it was against Slavs, it was against Jews and Russians, that they were not as good immigrant stock as the Nordic, the English, and the Germanic populations were. And Congress, for the first time in 1917, imposed what we now call the famous national origin quota system, is that we will limit immigration by a number which was based on the number of people from that nationality in the United States in 1890s. And it was meant to exactly favor Northern and Western Europeans over Southern and Eastern Europeans and Jews. And Congress passed it over President Wilson's veto. And it essentially was our law till 1965. And between 1917 and 1965, I'll only quote two things which have relevance in our history. One was during the Second World War, we interned Japanese. These were not immigrants, these were US citizens who we decided to intern just because of their national origin. This was a progressive president like FDR doing it. And FDR also is known to have restricted and frequently also stopped the Jewish migration to the United States when ships were turned away from our coast and many of them perished in the Holocaust. So we don't have exactly a very rosy history about immigration and refugee. And Congress tried to lift the national origin quota system because we thought it was a vestige of racism in 1952, and Congress overrode President Truman's veto, and the national origin quota system remained our law till '65. It was only when President Kennedy started his run for presidency that one of the first things he promised that he was going to lift the national origin quota system. And the national origin quota system was actually not lifted during Kennedy's time. He did not live to see the end of the national origin quota system. President Johnson lifted the national origin quota system. And he made it a huge priority of his. The recent history of the 65 Acts, if none of you, because we just celebrated 2 years ago the 50th anniversary of the 65 Act. Those of you who have interest in this is absolutely worth reading. There's a great NPR reporter called Tom Gelton who wrote a whole book on the 65 Act based on the archival material from the Johnson Library. And his promise was, look, just tell me what had President Kennedy promised. I'm an accidental president. I'm here only because he didn't live. What had he promised? And immigration is one of them. He said, that becomes my duty to do. And Congress finally got rid of the national origin quota system, and we equalized opportunity of the world for all people from all across the country. And our picture, our profile as a nation of immigrants completely changed. So let me begin with this. This is the history of our immigration. These are the trends over time. And this, as I said, this is the beginning of the 20th century, the great high peak of immigration, and we have essentially another high peak here, which is what we are going through today. So in many ways, what country is going through today is not really much different than it was going through in the beginning of the 20th century. These are two big waves of migration. And the beginning of at that time, the foreign-born population of the United States was pretty close to about 15%. Today, the foreign-born population of the United States is inching towards 14%. I suspect by the time I come back to Denver, we'll be pretty much getting close to the high peak of per capita immigration. Now, where are these people settling? Now, for a long time, the immigration in our country was a fundamentally six-state phenomenon. These are the 6 states. Sorry, I'm not as good at this. These are the 6 states which dominated our immigration history for a very long time. This is the great 6 states of reception. That even about, if I did this speech 15 years ago, about 67% of our immigration would be in these 6 states. But now numbers are adding. There are now 3 more states in the country which have more than 1 million people. And this has just happened in the last 1 year or 2. Massachusetts, Georgia, and Virginia have now joined, as I like to call, the Million Immigrant Club. But fundamentally, this was a 6-state phenomenon. And what's important about this, which is why this has become such a sharp issue in our body politic, is that there's been a huge, rapid rate in immigration. It's happened only since 1990. And these are the 14 states where the population of foreign-born people, which is what you would normally call immigrants, has gone up like 270% since 1990. Colorado has joined the list. Colorado, I won't tell you, its foreign-born population has grown about 279% since 1990. Now, this is where people are coming from. This is the list of the top 10 countries where people in the United States, foreign-born population in the United States are from. It's a very probably familiar list by now. This is Mexico and all the way down to Guatemala. What you will notice is that there's not a single European country on this list, which will tell you. If you looked at our 1965, the time when I described when President Johnson rewrote the 1965 Act, these were the top countries of admission. So you don't have to be a political genius to see that this map has completely flipped in such a short period of time. The only country which figures in both these lists is Mexico, which sent people at that time and continues to send people now. And this I put in because the refugee stuff has suddenly become an important part of our debate, that this is if you look at in our recent refugee flows, this is how it has gone in peaks and ebbs. We reached the peak of refugee admission in 1980, not surprising, this is when we took the largest number of people from after the war, end of war in Indochina. And the low point was 1977 when we admitted pretty close to 19,000 people. Now, this is where top regions of our refugee admissions in 2016. This is the Near East mostly, and Africa hugely, a very small number from Latin America and Europe, and even from Asia. And if you look at this as you compare it to 1990, how different it was. This was hugely Asia. This was predominantly Southeast Asian refugees, and it was a good chunk of the former Soviet Union, mostly Jews and Pentecostals at that time. And this is where they are settling. Refugees are not going all across the country. Refugees are settling in relatively small number of states in big numbers. And these are sort of the big states in this. and you can see the numbers. Colorado, and we have the refugee coordinator, Kit of Colorado here, who obviously knows more about this than I do. Colorado, from our numbers, took about 1,600 refugees in fiscal year 1916. That's where you are in this list. So, as I said, more than half of the refugees actually settle in about 10 states of the country. Now, this is the picture slide that summarizes good part of our discussion. Now, in our history, as I said, we have had immigrants obviously for a long time. We have never had this large concentration of unauthorized people in our immigration stream. 25% of the foreign-born population on the United States today is foreign-born. Never before in our history, except in recent times, is that the unauthorized population actually is going down. But I'll come to that in a second. So if you read this, a pie chart of our whole foreign-born population, it's predominantly now naturalized citizens, lawful permanent residents, who we call green card holders, and then unauthorized. And this is a list of states where at least 1/3 of the population of the foreign-born population is unauthorized. Now, if you really look at all these states, this is not the traditional 6 states of the country. So for a number of these states, their introduction to immigration actually is relatively recent. And it has unfortunately come through the lens of unauthorized immigration. I don't need to remind you that all these 12 states voted for Donald Trump in the last election. Colorado actually is almost going to be on this list. Colorado, from our estimates, is about 163,000 for unauthorized people. That is pretty close to 30% of the foreign-born population in the state. And Denver has, I think, 41,000 unauthorized people from our numbers. Now, this is, as I said, despite remarkable growth in unauthorized population, our unauthorized population is actually going down. It reached the peak in 2007, and since then, it almost every year has been coming down. But today, still about 11 million people in this country are unauthorized. Not a small number by any stretch of imagination. And these are the regions from which the unauthorized people come from. Not surprising to any one of you, about 57% of them are Mexicans. If you then add the Central Americans, we're talking about pretty close to about 80% of our foreign-born population is from one region of the world. But this is where it becomes more complicated in our body politic, is that if you look at how long these people have stayed here, of the 11 million people, a lot of them have stayed here now for a very long time. 59%, pretty close to 60%, have lived here for more than 10 years. And about 82% of them have lived here for more than 5 years. So it's not a people who just come across the border last year and have not had roots in our communities. This is a well-settled, and this is the slide that gets everyone's sort of the heartstrings. That if you look at our unauthorized population, if you look at a household, at least one parent is unauthorized, there are like 5.1 million kids in a household with at least one parent. And about more than 4 million of these people are US citizens born in the United States. And therefore, when you think about the specter of deporting all the 11 million people, we have to contend with the fact that are we going to deport 4 million people who are US citizens by birth. Now, these are facts. These are not Republican facts and Democratic facts. These are not red state, blue state facts. These are completely facts. I think almost everyone in the United States agrees. This is the general story about our immigration. Now, what about our labor market, which is very key to understanding what's happening in our country? Now, 17% of our US civilian labor force is foreign-born today. But if you look at, in the civilian labor force, what percentage of people have less than a high school degree, which is by definition unskilled people? That's about 53%. But on the other hand, also 17% of our labor force, which has more than a college degree, are also foreign-born people. So we have both on one, the unskilled worker and the skilled worker, a very significant proportion of our people in the labor force are foreign-born. And 5% of labor force is unauthorized, which is quite a large number. Now, you would tell me, so how did this happen? Why did this suddenly, our labor market suddenly change? And this to me is sort of one of our least appreciated phenomenon of our immigration strain, is that in 1990, when Congress last time it rewrote legal immigration, it was convinced, I was in the discussion those days, there were small memos issued by consulting firms convincing the members of Congress that we no longer need unskilled people in this country, that the country was going to need computer engineers, financial analysts, Wall Street and Silicon Valley is what was going to go. And obviously, Wall Street and Silicon Valley has been important for our country. But where the big labor market growth has happened is in the low-wage sector of our economy. And this particularly, all of you are not surprised by this is in construction, this is in agriculture, this is in various sectors of our service sector, from elder care to infant care to health care to janitorial services. This is where the big growth in our labor market has happened. It also happens that that sector of a labor market has systematically experienced decline in wages. If you look, taking inflation into consideration, wages today are lower than they were in 1973. The number of people enforcing our laws at the federal level is smaller than we had in 1979. And we know a number of factors are responsible for that. Enforcement is not the only one. Unionization has gone down, globalization and outsourcing has become an important part of this. But wages in the low-wage sector of our economy have systematically been going down. But the second factor on this, and not getting enough attention, is that we have become a more aging society. We are fast getting the trappings of European societies. I don't think I'll shock any one of you that baby boomers who started retiring in 2001, 10,000 baby boomers are retiring a month. By 2020, all 78 million baby boomers would have turned at least 55. By 2030, all 78 million baby boomers would have become at least 65 or older. Our estimates are that by 2030, 1/3 of US population will be over the age of 55. We are fast becoming like a European society. So for an aging society like this, what we constantly need is an infusion of economically active, tax-paying workers. And this is where one of the other unappreciated phenomena of immigration is happening. That Social Security Administration, I don't know how many of you pay attention to it, actually keeps a record of people who are making contributions, but we don't have a Social Security, at least a correct Social Security, to match those contributions. And they're actually kept in something called a suspense file. And anyone who knows about suspense files knows that these are contributions made by people who don't have the right Social Security number, perhaps therefore by default are unauthorized. Guess how much money is in the Social Security suspense file today? The last time I checked, it was $1.2 trillion. Trillion with a T. So as I keep on telling people, if you're concerned about our Social Security system, thank an unauthorized worker every day in our life. So this is about our aging society. We have also become a more educated society, which is a good thing. The same thing, my favorite term, the beginning of the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, only 10% Americans graduated high school. Today, 85% Americans graduate high school, which is a good thing for the society, obviously. But it has implications in the labor market, that when you have someone with a high school degree, he's not aspiring to be cleaning rooms for the rest of their lives or to work in agriculture for the rest of our lives. And that is obviously beginning to have huge impact in the labor market. So therefore, if you look at the combination of both these pull factors about how we need more workers and sort of the push factors, we have seen sort of the picture of our labor market today. So if you're if you're a rightly educated person, you would say, well, if this is true, why don't these immigrants come through legal means and enter the labor market? So in some odd ways, supply and demand is working magically, except unauthorized and illegal channels are used for the demand to meet the supply. And that's really the dilemma of our immigration system. We haven't caught up in changing our immigration selection system. We have an immigration selection system which is based on a 1952 architecture for a 21st century modern economy, and it's no longer working. This is sort of the state of our legal immigration system. We admit about 1 million people every year as green card holders, which is a large number, more than any other country. In fact, combined of all the European countries, we take more people as legal permanent residents than those countries combined do. And this is the basis. About 65% of our immigration is family-based. About 15% is based on employment. Rest is what we call humanitarian, which is the refugee, and a set of diversity visas, which we pick people on the basis of a lottery every year. But each of these categories, these small charts in the pie, are backlogged. If you just look at the family immigration system, this is people coming on the basis of sponsorship from families. This is just the first. These are unmarried kids of U.S. citizens. If you are from Mexico, you have to wait 21 years to be in the green, to be eligible. If you're from the Philippines, you have to take whatever it is, 11 years. So if you're looking at second, which is the unmarried son and daughter, and if you're from Mexico, you have to wait 21 years in the line. If you're the fourth preference, which is the siblings of U.S. citizens, these are the backlogs of almost all countries. If you're from the Philippines, you have to wait 23 years to join with your sibling in the United States for legal immigration. Now, we say that's family. What about the employment base where we really need people? So this is the state of our employment-based immigration. That if you're from this second preference are people who come with master's degrees. So if you've been sponsored by IBM and you have a master's degree and you're from China, you have to wait 4 years. If you're from India, you have to wait 8 years. And this is from people who have bachelor's degrees at least. You have to wait 12 years if you come from India and 4 years if you come from Philippines. So this is the state of our backlog, which is what a lot of people claim is responsible for what we now popularly call the broken immigration system. That we just do not have a selection system that matches the needs of our economy. Again, these are facts. These are not right-wing facts, left-wing facts. These are facts I think all of us agree. So let me now switch to policy. If these are the facts, why is policy not catching up with these facts? And actually, it is catching up with these facts. People who analyze policy for a long time, including us and people on the other side of the aisle, actually quite agree that what we need is comprehensive immigration reform, which is a combination. On one hand, we have to bite the bullet and do something about the 11 million people who are without status, because it's not good for any society to have 11 million people with compromised rights. So getting them status, whether you do this in one big swoop or you do it in staggered ways, is what everyone seems to agree on. About 65% of the country's population and almost all polls believe that we should legalize the unauthorized population. We can all disagree on the edges about how quickly that should happen, but the need to legalize is evident. We should also increase enforcement, because to have this level of unauthorized people is not good for the society. Now, we have done almost everything we can do at the border. I'll come to that in a second. Where it's generally recognized where we to do more is in the workplace, that we need to find better ways of making sure that only people who are authorized to work are actually working in the United States. And third is that we need to change the methods through which we admit people, so that for future flows, people can come to take jobs in the country in a legal way as against in the unauthorized way that they're now doing. But comprehensive immigration reform hasn't happened. It has eluded the country for at least 17 years now. But in the meantime, it's not that we are at standstill on immigration. What has happened is that we have had huge rise in enforcement in the United States. Today, we spend about $19.7 billion on enforcement. Probably all of you are surprised to tell you if I tell you we spend more on immigration enforcement than we spend on the combined money that we spend on FBI, Secret Service, ATF, FDA, and the TSA. These are the major federal law enforcement agencies of the country. And immigration never gets the credit for enforcement. We spend more money on immigration enforcement than we spend on these things collectively. And we have increased the budget of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement and of the Customs and Border Protection from 2005 in these numbers, which I don't have to repeat. You can read them. We have doubled the size of the Border Patrol from 2005. And if the proposals for the next year's budget go into place, we'll continue to increase them. At the same time, our removals of people would say that, look, we don't really enforce our immigration laws. No one is removed. If you really look at the removals, we reached the peak of removals about 400,000 in 2013, and we're very close to that number not as high that number in 2016 as well. So we're removing pretty close to 400,000 people a year, despite the fact that many people believe that we remove almost no one. And look at the apprehensions. This I thought, I was telling some people at dinner yesterday, I never thought I would see this in my lifetime, that the number of apprehensions at the border, people we catch at the border, has now reached historic lows in the last 5 or 6 years. We would catch about 1.7 million people in 1997. Today, last year, we caught only about 400,000 people. In 1997, about 98% of people we apprehended at the border were Mexicans. Last year, I think for the first time, we'll believe that majority of people we apprehended at the border were non-Mexicans. So the number of people trying to get admitted from Mexico is fast declining, and we have actually reached a historic low. Now, there are obviously many reasons for why the border crossings are going down. One is the Great Recession. Obviously, when there is less demand for work in the United States, people are not going to come. Unauthorized workers, more than anyone else, are rational actors. They just follow where the jobs are going to be. If there are not any jobs, they don't come. And we also know that we have increased border enforcement. We actually now make it very difficult for people to cross the border. There's a consequence to coming to the border illegally. In the past, we used to give a U-turn to people, and they may cross again next day or next week. We no longer do that. We catch people, we put them in criminal proceedings, they have a record, and if they try to come back, they'll be committing a felony, which is much easier for them to remove. But most importantly, which is again not appreciated enough, that Mexico has gone through a huge change. Mexico today is actually becoming a big exporter of information technology to all of Latin America. Mexico has improved its education system, so fewer people are inclined to come to the United States and take the hazardous journey than they used to do in the past. So if these are the facts about removal, and these are sort of the facts about what Congress should be doing in policy terms, why has it not happened? And this is where I say it's all about politics. Politics is at the center of this phenomenon. And we don't have, that much time to talk about politics, but let me quickly run down for you what I believe is the recent quick history on politics. That I like to think that the modern history on immigration started in 2000, when President Bush got elected in the US, President Fox got elected in Mexico. And these were two presidents who had meeting of minds on immigration. And their general belief was that we should find a willing worker to match with a willing employer. And we thought this was going to happen quickly. it did not happen. 9/11 happened actually the day before Mexican President Fox was going to address the joint session of Congress. And the 9/11 essentially made it impossible for us as a country to talk about immigration in any ways other than security lens. So nothing happened in immigration from 2001 to 2006. Congress started debating comprehensive immigration reform legislation in 2006. There was actually strong bipartisan support. Senator Kennedy, Senator McCain leading those efforts. Senate even passed a bill, but it did not become law. Because by the time we reached the 2008 election already was informing the way people were looking at immigration reform. Senator McCain, who was a big proponent of immigration reform, distanced himself from that legislation because he was running for the primaries in 2008. So Congress did not pass immigration reform. We had 2008 election. You finally elected a man who was the only person in the history who was the son of a foreign student. Constitutional scholar, we thought this was now going to happen anytime. And it didn't happen. Guess what happened? We had a big recession. It became politically impossible for members of Congress to talk about admitting more people or legalizing 11 million people at a time when we had reached a record unemployment and recession in our country. And then 2012 happened. President Obama got reelected by some estimates by a thumping majority, not in popular vote, but in electoral college vote. And everyone, both Republicans and Democrats, took from that the sign that this is now going to happen. Republicans, those of you remember from that time, Speaker Boehner himself actually went on record saying that this is going to be a priority and this was going to happen because it was important for the Republican Party, because they saw in the Latino vote that if they don't manage to attract a good section of the Latino vote, that the Republican Party was forever going to become a minority party. To be completely bipartisan on this, Democrats read the same signal. They saw the intensity of the Latino vote and they said, unless we keep on courting the Latino vote, we will not keep on making the electoral progress that we made. So there was an autopsy, famous autopsy done by the leaders of the Republican Party, where they said, we have to make immigration reform a centerpiece of our campaign. And guess what? Senate, by 68 votes, passed a major immigration reform bill in 2013. There were the Gang of Eight bills, 4 Republican, 4 Democratic senators who shepherded that bill. 68 votes, we don't get to almost anything in Senate these days. And Senate managed to get past this major comprehensive immigration reform bill in 2013. And everyone thought this is the year this is going to happen. Not that easily. By the time the Senate hit the House bill, the House had a totally different politics on this. Because as I like to see on issue, election is always that matters. And by the time when 2013 legislation was introduced, they were looking at the 2012 backdrop for the election. By the time it hit the House, they were looking at 2014 for their midterms. And in the Republican primary, immigration does not sell well. All it does is invite opposition from more restrictionist people. And Republican majority shied away, and Speaker Boehner finally had to abandon the idea of a comprehensive immigration reform, and the country reached another paralysis. Now, I'm mentioning the autopsy of the Republican Party because only a Washington Post reporter told me this recently, that while the Republican Party elders in their autopsy thought that immigration reform was critical, Latino vote was important to that, on the same day, at the day of the autopsy, an application was filed in the US Trademark Office in DC by a man called Donald Trump to patent the word "Make America Great Again." He had read the election in a completely different way than the orthodoxy of the Republican Party had read. And I don't have to tell you how that story ended. In 2016, you could say we produced one of the most divided results in our country, dividing the country in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. So Congress has failed to take up immigration reform for now close to 16 years. But in the absence of that, in the absence of paralysis in Congress, what we have seen is the rise in activism in the states. And this activism, I have to tell you quickly, strangely, many of you don't remember, started in Colorado. It started in 2006, the first state in the country to introduce a major, what we call omnibus immigration bills, which is bills which have more than one component on enforcement, on public benefits, on employment, was actually passed by Colorado legislature in 2006. Your attorney general at that time, whose name actually I don't remember, actually opposed the bill. He said, look, this is really foolhardy. This sounds good for effect. This is really going to be very difficult to enforce, and it's not actually going to save us any money. But the legislature passed. Colorado was then followed by a number of states, Alabama and Arizona most prominently in 2010. And the Arizona's Bill 1070 became sort of the hallmark of state activism in it, which led to the Supreme Court decision in 2014 saying that states have very minimal role in immigration. But state activism also, but obviously, has taken a new hold in light of President Trump's election. 33 states since President Trump's election have now introduced bills to increase the ability of the state and local cops to increase immigration enforcement. To be completely fair, many states, particularly California and Illinois, have gone on the other side of this and passing laws which sort of limit the ability of the local police and state police to engage in immigration enforcement. Again, evidence of a divided country. Now, while obviously Congress and our lawmakers are paralyzed on this issue, what about the rest of us, ordinary thinking citizens? I think for us, this paralysis does raise very important fundamental questions about who we are as Americans and the values we aspire to. I'll just start three of them. First, the rule of law, an important part of our value system. What kind of respect for rule of law are we showing when an employer on a daily basis does a wink and a nod to accept papers from people he knows are not right so that he could hire someone for a job for which no US worker is either available or willing to take that job? What does it do for a national cohesion when you have 24 states, I think 26 of the states of the country suing the President of the United States on his executive authority and 24 states opposing it? What does it mean for our national cohesion when two neighboring counties have diametrically opposite policies on immigration? I like to say that in New York, we have in Long Island and Nassau and Suffolk counties, literally next to each other, have diametrically opposite immigration policies. That if you're an immigrant who does the wrong left turn in Atlanta, Georgia, you will be deported almost immediately. But if you get caught in San Francisco, nothing is going to happen. It's not good for our national cohesion. And finally, what kind of moral values are we espousing when we tell an unauthorized worker, look, we trust you to take care of our infant child, and we trust you to take care of our older grandmother, but we don't trust you with membership in society. These are deeply important, rooted American values, which are constantly getting threatened in our immigration dilemma today. Now, you may say that, my God, why would you feel anything optimistic about this? But I actually, strangely, feel optimistic. And why I feel optimistic about this is, again, rooted in history, which is what I started. And going back to the early part of the 20th century, when I said was the first major wave, when we imposed the national origin quota system. At that time, lawmakers were basically struggling with the same thing, that these people are not good for the country, they're not assimilating. And guess what? And these were talking about Europeans. But we know that that great wave of immigration gave rise to our own industrial revolution and ushered in the big rise of the growth of our major cities. I happen to believe that today's mass wave of immigration will be equally momentous for the future of our country. In many ways, actually, it's going to be more momentous for two reasons, just from pure historical and analytical reasons. First, it's a much more diverse wave than the wave at the beginning of the 20th century was, and diverse in two different ways. The wave of the 20th century, Europeans who came here in large numbers, were mostly relatively uneducated, relatively low-skilled people. European middle class and educated people did not migrate to the United States except for the Jews who were fleeing persecution. Almost the rest of them, they were quite happy in Europe. Today's mass migration is quite significantly highly educated and highly skilled. And let me just tell you snapshots of that, because good part of my presentation, I was focusing on the low-skilled immigration for good reason. 1/4 of our medical doctors today are foreign-born. The number I heard recently, and I was really struck by, that if you look at the 7 major top cancer research centers in our country, 42% of scientists in those are foreign-born. If you look at one third of our computer engineers are foreign-born. If you look at PhDs, 53% of our PhDs last year were foreign-born in computer sciences. 47% of our PhDs in math were foreign-born. About 56% of our PhDs in engineering were foreign-born. If you look at the startup companies in Silicon Valley, shifting to Silicon Valley, which have a valuation of more than $1 billion, 51% of these startup companies were started by an immigrant. If you look at the Fortune 500 companies, people tell us now that 40% of our Fortune 500 companies were founded either by an immigrant or a child of an immigrant. And the thing that tickles me the most, in 2016, US won 6 Nobel Prizes. It's, I think, one of the highest in our history. All 6 were foreign-born. So when you really look at the diversity of the immigration on the skill and education base, it's hugely changed from the time of the early part of our 20th century. The second part of diversity is the geographic and the religious and the ethnic background of these people. Today, we have people from all parts of the world because of, thank God, end of the national origin quota system that President Johnson helped accomplish. People from all parts of the world are coming. If you like, it tickles me every time. In New York City, every day, kids from 193 countries get up to go to schools. Now, New York City is not the only such city. If you really follow all across the cities, this is happening in all parts of our country. And so New York City is getting replicated. The issue is, are we up to this diversity? A very conservative thinker in this field called used to say that we have become the world's first universal society. And the issue is, are we up to this diversity? And here I tell you, I think we have great news, that while the rest of the world has sort of in the last few years seen evidence of tribalism, whether you see this in Europe, you see in Africa, you see in Asia, people who just are slightly different from each other keep on fighting with each other. We actually have taken people from all those regions of the world. You could look at every conflict region of the world. We have taken people from those countries, we bring them to the United States, put them in Brooklyn, and they all seem to get along well. That there is something about the chemistry of immigration that I think is uniquely transforming and uniquely American. As in the process of integration, of which many people here are better experts than I am, When immigrants come to this country, and this is not just recent, this has historically been our norm. Immigrants come and they change themselves. But in the process, they change ourselves and they change our own society. This is a two-way process in which the immigrants are constantly adding to the bloodstream of America in a way that nothing else does, which also makes us the unique country in the community of nations. Thank you.
My name is Carlos Martinez, the Executive Director of the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado, an initiative of Rose Community Foundation. As I had mentioned a little bit earlier, our second panel is really about putting a voice and a face to immigrants and refugees and what's happening right now at the local level. I'm very excited to have our panelists here this morning. I know of their work very, very well because our foundation funds all three of these organizations. And it's great to be able to have folks who can be with us today, who can really share that that not only that perspective of what's going on within their organization, but their personal perspective as well. So to my immediate, we're going to get going on this. To my immediate left is Sandra Hernandez, who's the Executive Director of Centro de la Familia in Colorado Springs. Next to her is Nicole Malacu, who's the Executive Director of the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, which is a statewide organization. And next to her is Michaela Goring, Executive Director from the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network. So all three of these individuals work with immigrants and refugees. And we're going to start off with Sandra first to give us a little overview perspective of the work that you're doing and how has your work changed in the last 6 months.
Absolutely. Well, let me, first of all, I want to thank your staff, or all the people that have been a part of this, have been so graceful since I've been here. In fact, I was on the end of the bathroom line and I was pushed up to the front. It's never happened in my lifetime, so thank you to all of you. Let me just say this. I am of Puerto Rican heritage, so those of us who were born in Puerto Rico are born with United States citizenship. That's just something that kind of happened. And so when we migrated to the United States, as my parents did back around World War II, they kind of had at least a bronze spoon in their mouths. It's not silver, surely not gold, because they were educated to some degree, okay, high school, and a little bit more of maybe first 2 years of college. And so they were able to go ahead and provide to us, me and my 3 siblings, a lifestyle that allowed us to actually get educated. I came to Colorado Springs about 1976. I thought this was heaven, the most beautiful place I'd ever seen in my life, even compared to the island of Puerto Rico. So I've lived here 40 years. And I'm a licensed clinical social worker, so I worked at different places. And in 1996, I was in private practice, and the Center for the Prevention of Domestic Violence had asked me at that time if I was willing to do some pro bono work. There was a lot of an influx of women who were in domestic violence situations, and there was no bilingual, bicultural counselors to provide mental health counseling for them and for their children. So I said, sure, why not? I'm doing well, and I believe there is a responsibility to give back. Those of us who have must give back. And so I went ahead and said, sure, why not? Well, one client became 2, 2 became 20, 20 became 26, and before I realized it, my waiting room was full of undocumented women and their children who were basically dealing with the post-traumatic stress syndrome that they have to experience when they actually are victims of domestic violence. So what I came to the conclusion with my partner at that time is that there was a real need to serve this population. And so we went ahead and we started a 501c3, which was Centro de la Familia back in 1996. So we've been in existence now for 21 years. Most recently, we have served 1,700 clients, a combination of kids and women, lots of women and even men and children also. So we're a mental health center. Even though we initially started to provide just domestic violence counseling, we saw the need to go ahead and broaden the mental health aspect. So we treat all kinds of different diagnoses, whether it's depression, anxiety, PTSD. We have kids who are dealing with the different autism and Asperger's that are prevalent in many of our youngsters. We also saw a need for advocacy. Many of our clients have to deal with landlords who are not treating them correctly. Sometimes they need our help in the schools also to intervene. At times our parents don't know that their children with special needs maybe need and can have a right to an individualized education plan. And so we are pretty established in Colorado Springs. We're called the safe haven. The kids come to Centro and they say, mira la casita, we want to, they don't want to leave. Parents have to drag them out. We make it very friendly for them. We're very respectful of them. One of the things that gravitated, I guess, me to commit 21 years of my life, because I'm going to retire in about 6 months, was that I really fell in love with this population. I mean, they come here with nothing, absolutely nothing, to work, to get a job. And that's the thing that they want to do. And many of them are single men who have their families over there, and once they get established, then they bring their children here. Some of them are single women also who come with no very low level of educations, maybe third, fourth grade, if at that, seeking jobs. When we first started Centro de la Familia, jobs were aplenty. People could thrive, people could do very well. There was a hitch in 2006, as was mentioned by our keynote speaker, when some of that legislation that Denver decided to go ahead and be forward on. But things settled down. But this last 6 months has been awful for our families, I think, as was alluded to. We have kids coming in with anxiety and depression. They go to school fearful that when they get back, their parents are not going to be there. The parents are hesitating to go anywhere. They will take the kids. What we've seen is that they will take the kids to school. But as far as any extracurricular activities during the weekends, it's like they're in a concentration camp, these kids. They don't let them go outside. They don't take them to the different parks and community activities that they used to before. So we've got kids who are suffering from anxiety, depression. It almost feels, when they tell me these stories, and I think a tear came to your eye, and a tear came to my eye when I remember the first family who came to me and they said, we do nothing. We go to school and that's it. It's so different than what it used to be for us before. Felt like a Nazi concentration camp is what the feelings came to me at that time. We are committed to providing the services to these kids and their family members at no cost. We were lucky to get a grant from the Colorado Springs Health Foundation to hire a therapist to do that kind of work. We would have done it anyway. We have never turned away a client. Most of our services are free, thanks to the generosity of an organization like you. Now, one of the things that I get amazed at is that with all the anti-immigrant feeling, we have gotten quite a lot of money from foundations, be they from the government, be they from private foundations, maybe one or two that haven't. But for the most part, they've been very supportive of the work that we do. And I'm grateful for that, and our families are very grateful for that. And I'm hoping that those foundations are going to continue to provide that kind of support for us in the future. The thought that I have for the rest of you is that we always need private foundations. So if you are familiar with the GIVE campaign that occurs every year around October, if you see Centro de la Familia's name there, we would love to have you donate to us. So muchas gracias.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Sandra. Nicole.
So my name is Nicole Malacu. I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. Thanks for having us here today. We represent 64 organizations across the state, and so they could be organizations from faith, labor, community-based organizations, as well as grassroots organizations who are working to improve lives of immigrants across Colorado. We do most of our work through policy, advocacy, leadership development, and civic engagement. And so a lot of the work that Mr. Chisti talked about earlier was really the result of grassroots organizing and leadership across the state to really push back on anti-immigrant policies back in 2010 when we saw Senate Bill 90 introduced here in Colorado. In 2013, CIRC and our members were critical in repealing that law and passing the Community Trust and Safety Act, which really dismantled all of the Show Me Your Papers element of that law, and really worked with sheriff departments across the state to say, like, we don't want our county dollars or our municipal dollars to be spent enforcing immigration laws. And so we've done extensive work throughout the state with rural and urban communities alike to be able to have all 64 sheriffs signed on board right now to not enforce immigration law and to not honor ICE holds unless there is a warrant from an immigration judge that really would then indicate some sort of deep criminal sort of offense that would warrant somebody being held beyond, you know, the typical 24-hour hold. A lot of our work right now, post-election, has really focused on rapid response, and so Michaela Remain is one of our members, but we've just had an unprecedented level of different stakeholder tables that have come together to build response post-election. There's a lot of folks working right now on the Sanctuary City debate, which at the heart of the matter is really about safe cities and creating spaces where we are able to really say that all community members are safe, regardless of folks' immigration status. We're working with the city of Boulder to work at the county level then, so in addition to the municipal level policies we can pass, we're really working at the county level across the board. And in Longmont, we're having a similar discussion. And one of the parts that comes up so frequently for us in our work is the sort of idea of, you know, the myth of immigrants as criminals. And I think one of the discourse pieces for a lot of folks is that, you know, crimes are committed by immigrants, and sort of the national discourse has lifted up to extreme cases where there were, folks who committed crimes in big cities, which were labeled sanctuary cities at the time. And I think this brings to heart, like, the issue of, like, you know, categorizing people, good or bad immigrant, on the basis of a civil offense. So an overstay of a visa is not a criminal offense, it's a civil offense. And so when we look at the 163,000 estimated undocumented folks across our state, as our other panelists have said, we're talking about people who want to work, live, contribute to their communities, help be a part of their municipal fabric in a way that contributes to society overall. And so I think the discourse and sort of the good versus bad immigrant has really been lifted up as a result of the national discussion. But here in Colorado, I think the values of folks really being welcoming and inclusive and spaces where people can carve out a life for themselves and their families need to sort of bubble up and rise to the top as we continue this discussion. The other part of our work that's been really great right now, one of the silver linings, is that we have an unprecedented amount of stakeholders and allies who are coming forward and wanting to really support our work. And so there's a particular role for them in the immigrant advocacy domain, and that is really holding our leaders and our congressional delegation accountable to, like, not vote for certain enforcement measures that are sort of floating to the top of the current environment, and really wanting people to see the value that immigrants contribute to Colorado.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. Michaela?
Well, I also want to echo everyone's thanks for being here. I feel like it is such an honor to be here, and I was so inspired by Mr. Chisti's keynote address, and just a reminder of the history that our country has been in and the moment in history that we are now. It's very inspirational to see all of you here. And I do, I think, like Nicole said, the silver lining of this is that there is a community of advocates and people who care about these issues coming together to fight back. And we've seen that, and it is a seed of hope and some inspiration, and I think think, what is otherwise a really challenging time. So as Carlos mentioned, my name is Michaela Goring, and I'm the executive director of a nonprofit organization in town called the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network. The acronym is extremely tricky. It's REMAIN. One of Mr. Chisi's colleagues, Hiroshi, actually is responsible for that misspelling, so blame him. But we exist because we're helping people to remain here in the United States. So our organization is primarily a legal services organization. We're an office that is primarily made up of lawyers, as well as we're really fortunate. Hearing Sandra talk makes me remember how important social workers are, and we've recently been able to add a couple of social workers to our staff, which has become all the more important in these times. So the work that REMAIN does really centers on two very vulnerable immigrant populations in Colorado. The first is children. So, and the second population is people who are at the Immigration Detention Center. So I'll talk just a little bit about our children's program, and then I'm going to spend a little bit more of my introduction talking about immigration detention, because based on executive actions that have been taken by this administration and directives that have come down from the Department of Homeland Security, those are really the changes that we're anticipating and that we've already started to see a change in enforcement and expansion of detention. So I'll spend a little bit more time talking about that. But I think the first thing that I want to start out with and just really emphasize to this group, and I think a theme that has been throughout our keynote and all the really inspirational panelists who were before me too, is rule of law. And it's such an interesting time to be a lawyer, because lawyers are usually the most reviled. And it's been, for the first time ever, I feel like lawyers and the legal community have just gotten this huge, it just feels so wonderful to be an attorney. All the bad lawyer jokes are sort of out. And really, I mean, you know, as we saw with the travel ban that came down and the response from attorneys who showed up at airports around the country, including here at DIA, a number of our staff were there and members of CERC. You know, lawyers really are the first responders, and I think it also just speaks to the power. I still have a lot of faith in our democracy and our Constitution, because we are seeing the rule of law hold up to pieces that we do. But what REMAIN does is provide attorneys to people who otherwise would have no access to an attorney. And I think one of the shocking things that this is such a highly educated and informed group, you probably already know this, but one of the more shocking things I think that exists in the U.S. legal system is the fact that there is no right to appointed counsel for people who are going through removal proceedings. And that means that kids who are as young as 3 or 4 years old have to be before an immigration judge with an attorney from Immigration and Customs Enforcement as opposing counsel. And if they don't have the resources to hire a private attorney, and if there's not a nonprofit attorney that can step in, they are on their own. Same thing for people who are in immigration detention. So people who are facing linguistic and cultural barriers, who are separated from all the documentation that they need to present their cases, a lot of times don't have contact with family members because they're in detention and people are very fearful to visit the detention center, also are expected to navigate an incredibly complex area of the law. Immigration law has been compared to the U.S. tax code in terms of complexity, but are forced to present their cases in those contexts. And, you know, I think we all know how grave the consequences can be for people who are in removal proceedings. Sort of tapping into the historical note of this, there was a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court in 1922 that said deportation or removal proceedings have grave consequences, including removal to a country where an individual may face harm or even death, separation and banishment from family, friends, and community, loss of livelihood, property, or all that makes life worth living. And it's incredible that with all of the attributes that the U.S. legal system has, this is a context in which, because these proceedings are considered civil in nature, we don't provide attorneys in this context, despite the fact that the decisions that the immigration judges are making are, and many times for many of the asylum seekers that we're representing, are literally matters of life and death. So that's really where REMAIN exists, to step in and provide due process and support and access to counsel. So we have an amazing staff, a small staff, but an amazing staff of 9 attorneys that work both with our detention program and our kids program. And then really the strength of our program is in the legal community and in the pro bono attorneys who literally come from all walks of life and who have maybe no experience in immigration law, but really courageously come forward and learn this area of law and represent clients in their cases. So I'll spend just...
Well, I'll get back to you because I have a question on what you're
I
going to
can
go in
end
there.
now. I
So
can
I'll
stop
just
there.
just hold it for a minute, okay? So Sandra, I'm going to go back to you for a minute right now. Yes. So when you talk about the trauma, the fear that children go through, that mothers go through, can you just talk a little bit more about kind of like what goes on in the household when all this is happening, and how is it that families try and stay together and keep it together? Because it's just I just can't imagine that.
Well, you've got to realize that we have a lot of single moms with children, but we also have intact families also. So these are parents that are working sometimes 2 jobs, okay, just to try to make ends meet. So, I mean, they're tired, okay, they're stressed. Sometimes they become irritable just because of feeling tired. Now you have to have the fact that they could be removed from their home. That any time anybody could go ahead and come to their home, or when they're driving. There's a lot of caution about driving. Many of these people don't have licenses because that whole system that was going to happen somehow got delayed. I'm not sure what happened with that. You probably have a good idea. And so we have another level of stress. Immigrant families are stressed enough as it is. Now you add the layer of the fact that they might be removed, as you were saying, which means that they lose everything that they have to a country that they may not have any knowledge about, particularly if they're young children, and that they're scared. They don't know what Mexico's like. They've never been there. Many of these kids don't know Spanish, or if they know it, they'll very little of it. The parents know that Mexico isn't a safe place. There are no jobs there. They're not going to be able to go ahead and find jobs in Mexico. And so what we have is, unfortunately, the rate of child abuse and sometimes domestic violence will rise. And so we have to deal then with that other component of that. So what we try to do is to intervene. We have mental health therapists for the mom. We have it for the kids because they're different issues, and the fathers are more than welcome to come. What I've seen is a rise in the Hispanic men willing and wanting to come to therapy, which is a great thing. But I think that just gives you, it's just another level of stress for families that are contending with many barriers. So we have one more thing that they have to contend with.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nicole, you had mentioned that you work with 64 organizations throughout the state, and I'm sure that's a challenge in itself. But you're also hearing a lot of the stories that happen in community from these 64 organizations. In your role there at CIRC, how do you take what's happening on the ground and help to do advocacy and policy change? Because I know that your organization does a lot of that advocacy and policy change. How does it come together to create a better ecosystem for immigrants and refugees?
So one program or initiative that we had starting in 2010 was the Campaign to Unite Colorado, where we launched a hotline for folks to be able to call in where they'd had an infraction with ICE or an incident with ICE, so we could sort of pinpoint where these things were happening across the state and take that data and really work with our sheriff departments on the bigger policy pieces. But as a result of the hotline, what we found is that across the state we were getting calls from people who were put in small local county jails and sort of like learning all of the repercussions for their families when they were put in local jail, then transferred to ICE. We would get calls weekly from people across the state, and many of our leaders of folks who can't even find their loved ones. So once they're picked up in a local jail, sometimes they're immediately put over to the detention center, and so for a period of about 8 hours, they don't know where their loved one is. And so we get a lot of calls from people across the state in that regard. One of the things that the hotline hotline has been instrumental in doing for us is really becoming a leadership pipeline. So folks who had previously called that hotline back in 2010, 2011, 2012 are now leaders in our coalition and helping to document the cases of other people who are going through the same scenarios. So we have a leader named Mercedes in the northern region, in Boulder, Longmont area, whose husband was picked up driving to work, and as a result, their family just encountered one of the most difficult circumstances. Their income was taken away. The children were traumatized. Right now, the remaining daughters have, anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. But this woman has said, I am the documenter for Northern Colorado. I will take these calls because I don't want another family to experience what my family experienced. And so it gives me chills to sort of see how over the course of the line, we now have 150 documenters across the state who are on, being dispatched out, local phone calls from a center of the main line of the hotline, and really connecting with families across the state who are experiencing this. And I think the opportunity to educate community and to walk with them in that journey and in those really difficult moments has been just essential for our community. And then just one real quick, I know I haven't heard us talk about deferred action for childhood arrivals, but that is one program that right now so far does not look like it's up for being terminated. But one thing that we also find is that a lot of our youth that are documented, as we refer to them, there's about 70,000, is that what I thought, here in Colorado? That a lot of folks post, January were calling our local organizations, and there were folks who were talking about committing suicide, and folks who needed that urgent triage to be able to, all of a sudden these groups who are attached with advocacy, policy, civic engagement were becoming social workers and really trying to get folks pointed and connected with the right resources so that they could deal with the emotional trauma of knowing that all of a sudden they would not be allowed to work or continue to, pursue their educational dreams.
Michaela, I have one question for you. For a lot of people, it's a mystery of the process if someone gets detained to deportation. And from some folks that I talk to say it's a very inhumane process that people go through. Can you describe a little bit for us what that process looks like? And what happens from when someone's detained to being into ICE, the conditions they're in, to deportation?
Sure. So I think I'll tell the story of one of my very first clients when I first started working at Remain. And it's been really interesting when we look at the shift for the last 6 months. First of all, the Immigration Detention Center in Aurora doubled in October. So we went from a capacity of 500 people to 1,000 people, which is a huge shift, and we're hearing that there's going to be further exponential increases of detention in Colorado. But when I first started working at Remain about 14 years ago, what we saw was a lot of enforcement of longtime Colorado residents. So, and I'm sure Nicole and all the work that Cirque did, those are now your organizers, right? Those were the people who were initially getting arrested. And then about 5 years ago, it really shifted, and we saw a lot of people who were detained in Colorado who were asylum seekers, who were showing up at the southern border in Tijuana and in other areas, and then were transferred to Colorado because there was bed space here. So in Colorado, there is a multinational corporation called the GEO Group that runs a private immigration detention center here. So it's a civil detention center. And instead of, we were seeing about 2/3 of our population was brand new arrivals, no connections in Colorado, asylum seekers who had made some of the journeys that Kit described in her presentation. I mean, people fleeing from Ethiopia and taking ships to, Panama, and then journeying up through Central America, literally fleeing for their lives because of religious persecution or other grounds of persecution. So this is all a long way to answer. We've now seen that come around full circle, and we're seeing less of that population and now more enforcement of longtime Colorado residents. And I think that validates a lot of the fear that exists in the community right now, is that people are being targeted in new ways. But I'll start with the sort of full circle piece of this, I'll start with one of my very first clients that I worked with at Remain. Is a story of how someone ended up in immigration detention, and I think these are the stories that we're starting to see again now. So this was someone who originally from Mexico, a mother. She had 2 boys at the time who were 5 and 2, and was in Colorado Springs. Had a traffic ticket. Forgot to pay it, and so got a court summons to go to her traffic court ticket. And at that point, this was before CERC had done a lot of the policy work, but there was a lot more information sharing between local law enforcement and ICE. And so local law enforcement provided her information to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. She was taken into immigration detention, so without any notice for who was going to take care of her 2 little kids at the time, was brought to the immigration detention center that's in Aurora, and that's where we first encountered her in our Know Your Rights presentation. She is someone who had been the victim of pretty severe domestic violence, and is just an incredibly courageous, amazing woman, and had reported that victimization to law enforcement because she was really worried about the safety of her kids and also herself, and so had gone through that process. So when I met with her the first time, I was able to explain to her that there's this thing called a U visa that allows people who are victims of crime and who have helped either in the investigation or the prosecution of the crimes to be able to have this form of relief. And so ultimately she was granted a U visa. We were able to get, with the assistance of an attorney, I was able to represent her in a bond hearing. She was able to get released, but she stayed in civil immigration detention. So again, I just want to highlight, this is not for people who are facing detention as some sort of criminal punishment for what they've done. This is civil detention, which exists in our country in really horrific ways. But she was in detention for about 3 months and was navigating who was taking care of her kids. The horror of being separated. My kids were, young at the same time, and just thinking about the physical separation from your baby and what that does to them and your family. Anyway, she now was granted a U visa, is now a lawful permanent resident, is actually working for Health and Human Services in Colorado Springs, helping other families who are navigating these obstacles, and just, continues to be such an inspiration. But I think that's the type of story of people that get caught up in this system, and many of them are not lucky enough to either have some form of relief, because we know that immigration law doesn't allow paths to residency or citizenship as it exists right now for a lot of people, even if they've been here for a really long time and have family members who have been here forever.
So I'm going to have you do one last comment or data point or anything you'd like to go ahead and share with the audience. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so if you can be brief, I would appreciate that. And then we're going to call up all the panelists and engage the audience with the Q&A session. So Sandra, I'll start off with you.
Well, for me, I think it was the keynote speaker's statement that there is optimism in all this. I mean, we're all in the struggle. I think we all want the same thing, and that is for families to be able to live healthy and stable lives. And it looks like if we keep up the fight, maybe I won't be here to see it, but hopefully you will, and some of my staff will tell me about it. So it's exciting times at the same time.
Thank you.
I think one of the things I'd like to leave you with is just the incredible support we felt from so many, from funders, from institutions, from folks wanting to really band together in a way that was happening before, but maybe not at the scale. And so for us on the ground and our members on the ground, it's really important that we reach our families by whatever means necessary so that we can do the preventative work ahead of time, the Know Your Rights education, family emergency planning, sort of getting folks connected with mental health providers, talking about legal defense funds, all the things that we can do in advance so that we can protect our community members so they don't find themselves having to call Michaela after the fact that we have, 160,000 families to reach out there and educate. And so it's going to take all of us, and I think that we're in this moment where we can really look toward a vision of who we want to be as Coloradans. And I've said it in the past that all relief is local. And so when you watch state, legislative policy closely, you see that ending police-ICE collaboration was a local relief measure so that we would break the link between local law enforcement and immigration. When we look at driver's license, that's a first line of defense for immigrants. There's only 66,000 available for immigrants right now, unauthorized immigrants, and there's 166,000 people eligible to potentially get them. So when we look at the need for implementation and just cross sort of collaboration, there's just no better time for us to be able to rise to that challenge.
Thank you. Kayla?
Okay, I had 3 recommendations for the group. The first is ensure that Colorado remains a state where immigrants are welcome, safe, and protected. Which I think we are already doing a great job, but there's still a lot of work to be done. The second one is echoing on Nicole's point, and that's the federalism argument. It's interesting that where we've always looked to the federal government to protect on immigration issues, that's really flipped with this change in administration. And there's so much that the state and localities can do, but the recommendation is to ensure that voices like Chief Wilson's voice stay strong, and that local law enforcement does not participate in 287G agreements where we're blurring the lines between local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement. And then the third is to work to create a legal defense fund so that people who are caught up, particularly vulnerable populations like kids and people in immigration detention, if they are caught up in the system, they have a fair shot at accessing protections that exist under current immigration law as they navigate those very, very serious cases.
Well, help me giving them a round of applause to our panelists.